Test, test, test. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the M&A Mastermind Podcast, your go-to source for the latest industry trends and strategies to help level up your M&A practice. I am your host, as always, Nick Olson, Managing Director of Cornerstone International Alliance. I manage and direct a group of lower middle market M&A firms, help them take their practice to the next level. In this platform, we bring on masterminds who are experienced, knowledgeable, and gracious enough to share their knowledge with how they've succeeded in the world of M&A. As always, we want you to take away a couple of nuggets that you can implement in your practice from our discussions. And today, I'm really excited to have on my first ever repeat guest for the M&A Mastermind Podcast. He's the founder and a managing partner of Murphy McCormick Capital Advisors, located in Pennsylvania, a founding member of Cornerstone International Alliance, an avid tennis player, and one of the go-to resources here at Cornerstone. My guest today is Bob McCormack. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back, Nick. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. So kind of a quick backstory of how we kind of got here. You had written an article a couple of weeks back on the topic that we're going to talk about, and that topic is Goodwill. What is it and how can it affect my deal? So Goodwill, can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, but I know you came to a conclusion based on some personal experiences and wrote an amazing article. You can go to Murphy McCormick's website to check out the full article. I believe we have it posted on cornerstoneia.com as well. I'm highlighting Bob's great work. So, and as I read the article, I'm like, we need to get you on the show to talk about this because this is a great topic that obviously can come up in any transaction or any deal, and to be best prepared for that when it happens. That's kind of what the idea of this podcast is, and so appreciate you taking the time to talk about Goodwill, and hopefully everybody can learn a little bit something or new or something that they didn't know before that could help them, when that might come up in a future deal. So let's start the stage for today's discussion, Bob. Just what is Goodwill?
Yeah, so Goodwill's, and we get called many different things. Sometimes it's called blue sky, especially many of our older business customers that are in like the car dealer business or something along those lines, like to call it blue sky. But fundamentally, Goodwill is the value of the business over the tangible value of the assets. So if you think about maybe a company that has a $10 million valuation and they have fixed assets of $2 million, so fair market value of $2 million and receivables of $2 million, inventory of $1 million, you got $5 million of tangible assets there, but you've got a valuation of 10. That means there's $5 million needs to go somewhere. And that's intangible assets, and Goodwill's the typical placement of that. So it could be customer deposits, things along those lines if you're a bank, but it's an asset you can't put your hands around, but it's a real value. And that's the challenge I think some people have is they can't see the real value in Goodwill.
We're going to dive into what it is, but what are some things that advisors out there can look for to find out more about what a company's Goodwill might be or might have?
Well, it usually starts with most of us do some sort of business valuation before we take an engagement on. And that business valuation is typically driven by the value of the cash flow stream, whether it's EBITDA or some proxy for cash flow. And so that will yield an enterprise value of the organization. And from that, you can back out of the tangible assets, and that should yield a level of Goodwill in the business. Now, there's some, you take we do some work in the natural gas industry. So sometimes the natural gas industry is not doing great. So all those gas water trucks and sand trucks that are flying around Pennsylvania, sometimes the value of those fixed assets are worth more than the value of the cash flow stream. And so in that case, the liquidation value of those assets are worth more than the tangible, the enterprise value of the company.
Mm-hmm. So how is Goodwill created?
Well, goodwill is really created by the enterprise generating cash flows that exceed the value of those assets. And that's usually done over a period of time. So you think about a manufacturer of, well, I'll use an example, and it fits with Cornerstone too. So it's kind of good in that sense. Scott Bushke and I both sold a business that made businesses that made Polywood type furniture, resin based furniture. And so in some ways that if you just make one piece of resin furniture, it's a value of that piece of inventory. But if you start building a brand around that, and both companies were building brands, so they had customers, they had demand for it. E-commerce was taken off in both these customers. It was during COVID. So the value of that company, both those companies were exceeding the value of all the fixed assets they built, the plant, the receivables that were there in the inventory. And that was because the owners of both those businesses were generating cash flows that far exceeded the value of those assets. And so it takes time to build goodwill. It can go the other way pretty quickly, though. So let's take the banking industry, which I'm very familiar with, coming as an ex-banker. When we sold, the bank I grew up with was Core States Bank, which is now Wells Fargo. Core States, when it sold for 6 times the book value of the business. So if you think about the net book value of the business was X, but it sold for 6 times that. And that was based off customer relationships, deposits, the growth of the company, all those type things. Now we had Wells Fargo a few years ago, had the scandal in California where they were open multiple accounts for people that didn't actually want to open accounts. So they got picked on by the regulators. They continue to get picked on by the regulators. And now you have banks trading at net book value. There's no goodwill in those banks. So you could quickly have goodwill go the wrong way where there's no goodwill in a company. You can even create negative goodwill, which is really not a place you ever want to be. But goodwill really is generated by good operating businesses. So let's even take Cornerstone International Alliance as an example. You know, when you first started, you didn't start it, but we collectively started it. And you were the second leader. But when CIA first started, there was no value in this. I mean, it was just a bunch of brainstorming, sitting at a M&A source conference saying we need to do something, be a best practices group. What you've done and Scott's done and the rest of us have done, but really you and Scott, you've built a brand now, right? You build value. But how many fixed assets do you actually have, Scott? You got this microphone in front of you. You got a couple computers.
Yep.
You have nothing else fixed asset wise, right? But there's now a value to this thing. You know, not that you're going to go sell it, but there's a value there. So that value, that cash flow stream far exceeds that microphone in front of you and that computer. But it didn't happen overnight. You had to create a brand. You had to create a brand that could attract the international partners that we now have, that would attract the better firms in the United States. I mean, you just brought in Matt Bradbury, great firm in North Carolina. That wouldn't have happened if you didn't build a brand, right? So that brand value, that enterprise value is how you create goodwill. You look at most tech companies that are doing something, there's limited fixed assets in those companies. It's to value that future cash flow stream. You know, the Apple phone, when it first came out, I mean, I was a BlackBerry fan. I'm still a BlackBerry fan. I don't make them anymore. But you know, that value of Apple is they got a ton of cash on their balance sheet, but most of it is not the fixed assets. It's the brand of Apple. That's where that goodwill is. And so you look at Apple's balance sheet, there's a ton of goodwill in that balance sheet, stated or unstated.
Right, absolutely. You know, and in your workforce and the technologies in your processes kind of all play towards that goodwill. Is that correct?
It does. It's your workforce, your processes you have in place, the brand you built, the customer relationships you developed, the vendor relationships you built. All those play a big factor in developing goodwill. So again, if you're a bank, you know, you can allocate it to intangibles to customer deposits, for example. But if you're SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, you know, at one point they had a fair amount of goodwill in their balance sheet. You know, come the spring of this year or last year, that goodwill disappeared in total. And so they had good processes in place maybe at one point, but when they started getting upside down on their bond portfolio, upside down on their mortgage portfolio, making some unsecured loans, it could go the other way where you have negative goodwill.
When you're talking about, goodwill, it seems like it's a lot of the things that we look for in good quality, businesses or clients, and their companies to sell is, your brand, your reputation, your processes, your technologies, your management team. Like, do those two things go hand in hand?
Yeah, and that's usually a good starting point. Often, some early conversations we'll have with the business owners really tell us what your value proposition is. And that could be all those things you just touched on. We have great processes in place. A lot of times it's great people. Most of our closely held businesses really do revolve around their people and processes. Sometimes it's technology. There's or could be vendor or customer relationships, but it's really the value proposition that business brings to the marketplace and how that equates then into cash flows is really what often will help define that cash flow value. So if I'm a machine shop, for instance, and I'm just doing a job shop, your value is typically more closely related to the value of the equipment. Mm-hmm. If I'm a machine shop that has a really unique technology or process or people in place or have a unique set of customers or industry niche, we sold a company a few years ago that made machines that made the glass for the iPhones. And so that was a real niche. I mean, if you think about the Gorilla, I think it's called Gorilla Glass, that was developed, the machines to make that's a real niche out there. So having niches and understand the value proposition, you often can lead to where there's value that exceeds the cash flow value will exceed the value of the assets then.
Yeah. So definitely relatable. So when is goodwill a challenge? This all sounds great and awesome, but it can't all be perfect, right?
Well, goodwill can be a challenge in a few ways. One, if it's just made up and there's no substance behind it. So we will get the business owner that will do so it's sometimes called a capitalization of excess earnings, and maybe get a little too technical there, but they'll value the business, argue the whole value of the business is goodwill, and then they'll add the value of the assets on top of it, and they'll do some other additions to it. That's not real goodwill. Goodwill can be a challenge to finance. So, my roots as an ex-commercial lender. I grew up in a bank that did finance cash flow, but many banks struggle with not financing hard assets as collateral. So again, taking that early example, $10 million business, $5 million in tangible assets, and you got $5 million in goodwill. They may not finance any of that $5 million in goodwill without an SBA guaranteed loan or a guarantee of a buyer or a lot of subordinated debt. So that's one challenge. Really, the financing front is probably the biggest challenge in the lower middle market to the Main Street size businesses. When you get up to the higher lower middle market or the true middle market, those buyers tend to be people that have the ability to get non-bank financing and finance goodwill relatively, not easily, but more readily. The other place where goodwill gets to be a challenge certainly is when it gets to be impaired. So if you remember 2007 and 8 and 9, we had a financial crisis. Lehman Brothers, for example, caused most of this, or the whole market did it, but it precipitated a lot of action. So you had banks that really had good market values. They were trading at 3 times book, for example. Suddenly they're trading at 1 times book, and they're trading because of that, because they've lost customer relationships. They got bad loans in the books. The core deposits are leaving. The impact is when their auditor comes in on an annual basis, they're going to do a fair value calculation of the balance sheet. They're going to say, oh boy, you $10 billion bank now have $2 billion impaired goodwill in your balance sheet. And when that gets impaired, the financial impact is you credit goodwill as on the right side of the balance sheet and you debit a loss. And so suddenly, if I'm a CEO of a publicly traded bank, I don't want $2 million in impaired goodwill. I'm going to lose my job. So even when I was a CEO of bank, buying companies, insurance agencies, and things like that, I wanted to make sure I was doing it at the right value. And I thought through, not if this glass half full or half empty, but what happens if this glass breaks and that
Mhm.
goodwill goes away? I probably would lose my job. This is quite frankly what had happened. And so that's where it gets to be challenging. And that's where, we see we all know that's listening to this podcast, how much quality of earnings audits are taking place on deals. That Q of E is really focusing on earnings, if you think about it. They're doing some work on the balance sheet and working capital, but they're really focusing, is this cash flow value sticky? And is that cash flow value sustainable? And that's what justifies goodwill.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great explanation. Appreciate that. So how can goodwill impact the transaction itself?
I think it's really, one of the things we try to do with our engagements is we do a financing test. We do a financing test with every valuation we do, even if it's a fair market valuation for gift or ESOP or SBA loans. And the reason we do that is, one, we want to test what is reasonable in a financing perspective. So again, back to that, use that $10 million deal, for example. If we value it at $10 million and it truly does have a cash flow value of 10, intangible assets of 5, it will help us define who the buyer universe is. It obviously can't be, no offense to you, Nick, but it can't be Nick walking off the street with $500,000 in his wallet saying, I want to buy this business.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to go to the bank to get financing, because you're not going to be able to finance the deal. No offense again. But but it does define that we have to probably go to a strategic buyer, or we're going to have to go to a private equity type buyer or a family office that can support it. So deals that tend to have higher goodwill values will tend to push us as advisors more towards strategic buyers or people that can finance a deal, and even just pre-screening the buyer universe as you go about interviewing potential buyers. You kind of want to, really test them to see, can they get a deal done where there's a lot of goodwill in the deal. So again, we got a lot of great, back to M&A Source, a lot of good partners in M&A Source with private equity. Private Equity Info gives us a lot of great information on quality buyers. That really defines your buyer universe to some degree. And then we typically, our firm, and I think most of our peers that are part of Cornerstone, we spend a lot of times getting to our bankers. So I tell my guys, fall in love with the bankers out there that do M&A transactions, that understand goodwill. A lot of bankers don't understand goodwill, and that can impede the process of what we do too.
So, mostly, would you agree that goodwill is mostly positive?
Definitely, I would agree. It's mostly I really prefer to represent companies that have a good amount of goodwill in their balance sheet. If it's the value of the fixed assets, it's probably a marginal business. I mean, we'll certainly work with those, and there's a market for those, but really the best companies where you're going to get the most value for the client and the most value for the sellers is companies that generate a decent amount of goodwill.
Mm-hmm. As an advisor, and what can you do for your client to either, I guess, help them create, or help create value or higher goodwill, or on the flip side, decrease the impairment of the goodwill? What can our listeners do to help out that situation, positively on either side of it?
Yeah, so we'll deal with the first one, then the second one. So the first one is typically pre-going to market. So again, most of the CIA partners do valuations on behalf of their clients before they take an engagement. And part of that is doing kind of an assessment. Is this thing marketable now? Can we get more value down the road? And part of that, we often refer those clients back to a business coach, whether it's a Vistage coach or a specific business coach or whatever the case is. And there's two things we're focusing on. Can we grow EBITDA? And two, can we decrease the risk of future cash flow for a future buyer? So if you decrease the risk, it increases the multiple. If you increase the EBITDA, you increase the value there. So it's exponential increase in value for the business owner. So that's stage one, pre-going to market, helping them to create value. Second stage, after the deal's done, or you really want to do it before the deal's done, how can you make those cash flows sticky for the new owner? So again, back to the resin polywood furniture manufacturers, both of them. Leadership. There was great leadership both those companies. I think we didn't create that leadership; they were there. Scott and I recognized that leadership. We recognized the future value, but we also, over the years working with these clients, their business model became sticky. It became a recognized brand. So those type of things will help avoid a negative goodwill or goodwill impairment type issues. Ways to avoid it certainly are doing those type of things pre-market and working with a coach. Last thing you want is representing a client that the company's going down the tubes, and you don't share that information, or you take that engagement on, and then there's goodwill impairment right after closing. We stay in touch with all our deals that we close, and we really want them to do well, and that will yield more deal flow for you too. It becomes a flywheel, and doing most of it's pre-closing is avoiding goodwill. My attorney used to say at the bank that the best time to close the deal is before you close it, and he was right on in his advice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a thing that can be a positive impact for you as an advisor on your client's deal, and just to be more knowledgeable of what it is important. But then I would imagine, sometimes it can be somewhat of an art form to really take that, what is the goodwill, and showcase it, and make sure that your buyers understand that. And I guess one last question, Bob, is when you're looking at the goodwill, and that can be somewhat subjective, right? Do you ever have you ever had examples, maybe it's more common than not, where the goodwill on from your perspective is different than from the buyer's perspective, related to value?
Usually it's 100%. The values are different. And let me touch on one other. Let me come back to personal goodwill if I could, Nick, at some point.
Yeah.
So arguably one of the, if you think about an asset sale, often in the case in an asset sale, we just went through this right before I got on this with talking about a purchase price allocation. Mm-hmm. So many times buyers will want to write up the fixed assets to get depreciation all over again. And that's usually then the seller faces bonus depreciation taxes, which is an ordinary income. We prefer that it be allocated to goodwill, which is then capital gains treatment. And, again, there's some selling. So there's often a difference between an allocation of fixed assets and an allocation of goodwill. Sometimes the bank gets involved in that discussion. So, that's typically there's a disagreement on where that value is in just a purchase price allocation. And certainly it starts with the purchase price. Mm-hmm. Typically, we're not always agreeing on purchase price when we go through a process. So we're trying to drive to the highest net value to the shareholder. And there's usually a difference in what a buyer perceives the value is and the seller perceives the value is. Mm-hmm. I did want to touch on personal goodwill, just one other item.
Yeah, please do.
So there's a concept called personal goodwill out there. So it's often a tax strategy in a transaction. And if anybody wants to read the case, it's an interesting case called the Martin ice cream case. So in that case, there was a place where the value of the business was a C Corp, and you're trying to avoid double taxation in a C Corp, that you can allocate some of the purchase price to a key leader of the business. So instead of that goodwill being inside the business, that goodwill is allocated to the individual in the business. So it's often done for tax strategies, but it needs to be a legitimate size. So you need a CPA firm or someone like us to do a valuation or a fairness opinion saying it's personal goodwill. So you get capital gain tax treatment on that. But in some ways that's real too. It is real. It's moved outside the business to the personal side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely another variable to consider. I'm glad you were able to throw that in there as well. So I guess, Bob, in conclusion, this is all great stuff. if you were to just listen to this last, minute or two, what are the highlights and what are the key takeaways as an M&A advisor that you need to know related to goodwill and how you can best serve your client to make sure that they are maximizing that goodwill value?
Well, I think it again starts with doing that business valuation. So doing the valuation as is, looking at how that enterprise value gets valued across the tangible assets, and then what's potential left in a goodwill sense. Is it certainly always the right time to go to market? Is there ways to increase that value even further, which will impact goodwill, of course? I think the other piece is just really educating your client too, to make sure they understand the components of the value. And I think the other big one right now is, as I keep saying, we fall in love with your bankers. Get out to see your bankers and help educate them on what, this company's worth 10 million and 5 million of it's goodwill. How are you going to work with us to get this deal done?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's critical right now is really helping the bankers on the goodwill piece of this, on the intangible asset value of some of these businesses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a great overview. And it's always good and we talk about this with referral sources, with bankers, with attorneys, like be a resource for them so they can be a resource for your clients, their clients, and then it all kind of comes full circle to keep that, doing right by our COIs is always a good thing.
Yeah, Nick, actually, I try to get out to see banker communities and speak about things like business valuation and how to read a business valuation report and how purchase price allocation works, just so they know too. So, sometimes I get referrals out of it, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I get deals financed, but the more you're out there, and we as advisors, the more likely you're to get something in return by doing that.
You're creating goodwill, Bob, for yourself.
Hopefully, yeah. We got a computer and a white screen here, but that's about it.
Yeah. Like I said, your reputation and your clients and how you guys are doing. Like, yeah, you guys, I would say you have a lot of goodwill, just based on your track record and all the great things that you're doing. But Bob, I appreciate you joining today. Really great conversation, really great insights into goodwill. Hopefully our listeners are able to understand it better and be able to better serve their clients as it relates to goodwill and the value of their companies. Where can our listeners, if they want to learn more about and find this article or connect with you, like where can people find you and Murphy McCormick?
Yeah, so our website's www. Murphy McCormick, and McCormick spelled McCormack.com. And it's a great place to go. Certainly through CIA website too is also a way to get to us. And my cell is 570-412-4260. So all those alternatives.
Yeah, and I know you're always great to talk with, especially within our membership. We do best practice calls and sharing, and you probably have more phone calls with our members than I even know about, and that's just building that rapport and that trust, and so you're always available to our group. So I want to thank you for that. I know you're a valued resource for all of our members, so appreciate you joining. All the work you do for CIA. Thank you for joining the M&A Mastermind Podcast today. And that is all we have for today's episode. One thing that'll help Bob and myself out is if you could like, share, and comment this episode with anyone who you think might enjoy it, anyone who you think can benefit from our conversation here today. All of our episodes are on cornerstoneia.com/podcast. I know Bob's article on Goodwill is on the cornerstoneia.com website. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, all those great locations. So go like, share, comment, subscribe. Would help us out tremendously. And thank you all for listening today. Have a great one.